Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Foreign Policy Virtual Dialogue. This is actually the third in the last of a series from Foreign Policy that's been hosting on how democracy can uplift around the world, places all over the world. And today's event takes a closer look at gender parity and the solutions needed to ensure women's participation and practices and the solutions needed to mitigate these forces. My name is Rena Nainen, and it's my pleasure to be your moderator. While there are major gaps between men and women across all spheres of life, the gap in political empowerment means that it will take another 155 years for the world to reach full political parity. That's according to the World Economic Forum's 2022 Global Gender Report. This tracks evolution of gender parity across 146 different countries. Further, gender traditionalism is alive, it's well, and that's according to recent international men and gender equality survey. It's called Images. And that shows that even men who are supportive of equality become reticent to support specific policies proven to increase opportunities for women or even reduce discrimination against other sexual or gender minorities. Increasingly, illiberalism and authoritarianism globally are only making things worse with misogyny and rollbacks on democracy. It's not just hand in hand, but it's also fueling each other. And according to recent analysis by political scientists at Harvard, women's equal and active political participation is central to the battle for democracy. But it'll also take meaningful and broad engagement by men in power to help quell that rolling tide of illiberal misogyny around the world. I'm really happy to share with you that we've gathered a group of incredible government and civil society leaders to explore the dynamic around empowering men to be at the forefront of women's rights and how exactly that will strengthen democracy globally. So before diving in, I want to extend a very big thanks to the National Democratic Institute for helping us make this event possible. I've got a couple of housekeeping things I'd like to get into before we get going. I want to make sure that you can hear us as our audience. We've got hundreds of people tuned in and watching our live streams on social media. We've actually reserved a portion of this event for questions from our global audience. And here's how you can help and do this. If you're on Zoom, you just click on that button, the Q&A button below, and you submit your question. But do tell us your name. Also tell us where you're coming from, your organization as well. And we'd love to take your question. If you're joining us on phone or if you're watching the live stream, you can also email us. That email address is events@foreignpolicy.com. Again, it's events@foreignpolicy.com. And of course, we'd love to hear from you on social media. Do use the hashtag Unite with the number 4 Democratic Equality. That's Unite number 4 Democratic Equality. So let's get started. I'm honored to begin our program with our first guest, who has a long and distinguished career in diplomacy and also in national security. May Zabai Piu is the director of Gender Equality Network and also served as an advocate for women's rights to end discrimination against women and ethnic and religious minorities in Myanmar. She's also actively advocating for the inclusion of women, peace, and security agenda in Spring Revolution. May, welcome very much. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
You bet. So May, I want to start off a little bit with your experiences in Myanmar. You co-founded something called Kachin Peace Network and Kachin Women Peace Network as the conflict was gaining traction. Why was this your first instinct? As there's conflict around you, why did you see this as important to get started?
Yeah. Thank you. Growing up as a religious ethnic minority woman in Myanmar, so I have firsthand experience of the intersectional discriminations that women of Myanmar have faced for decades at the hands of the Myanmar military. So my experience has been magnified by the toxic, militarized, masculine culture. So I co-founded the Kachin Peace Network and Kachin Women Peace Network mainly because my natural instinct is to believe in movement building and network strengthening. What we are up against is a very strong, decades-old military institution, which is combined with Myanmar's deeply rooted patriarchal norms that seriously restrict the space for women's rights and the gender equality agenda to make their mark. So when I was establishing these networks together with my colleagues, I believe that we are stronger together when united than as individuals. We are as individuals not nearly as strong as when we can apply our collective force. So in forming these networks, we pull together our unit strengths, contacts, and abilities to create something that is stronger together and makes our networks responsive to the growing needs of the people arising from the conflict. So through the establishment of these networks, Kachin civil society organizations and women's groups have sharpened their advocacy skill set, and effective media engagement strategies were developed through learning by doing. Timely information sharing, media engagement, effective advocacy, and humanitarian aid delivery to the affected populations enables our local networks to be ones that people turn to for life-saving assistance, even when the international agencies can't gain access to conflict-affected areas. Our networks find alternative channels and routes to deliver aid, advocate the needs of people, and do resource mobilization. Using all tools available in our toolbox, we were able to elevate our people's issues at the international level. We were not only relying on the external donors, we were able to raise our own funds through local individual donors. We utilized social media platform through which we were able to launch concern, care, and contribute for IDP's Now campaign. And also the targeted contributors were non-Kachin individual donors who transcended the ethnic lines to express their caring for and solidarity with conflict-affected populations. So with these proceeds, we were able to provide Christmas meals for IDPs. Driven by this urge to foster and strengthen collective action, I helped found the Women Advocacy Coalition Myanmar at the beginning of the military coup d'etat that has wreaked such havoc on my country. So I will stop here for the first question.
May, it's a great point to pick up on. The focus of this panel today is about defending democracies around the world, uplifting gender policies that encourage women's political participation. But it's very hard when you're in the midst of conflict and there's struggle and other things going around. What has your experiences been when you're dealing with an unjust practice or unjust situation? What advice would you have for other women who are unaware of where to start when it can be so demanding and difficult when you're in a situation like this that's truly out of your control and justice is not being served?
Since the outbreak of the Kachin conflict, so I have been speaking out against the unjust treatment by the military and power holders. Because I speak truth to the powerful, we were attacked disproportionately by the Myanmar military. We were at high risk of prosecution, and my husband was framed by the authorities with a sham charge of defamation and was arrested as a result of it. But that did not stop me from standing up for my beliefs. So I would like to tell my fellow women's rights defenders that while this journey is long and tiring, it will have been rewarding in the end. We cannot do it alone, So we must organize, mobilize, and unite. Women before us, through their blood, sweat, and tears, did that of which we are now enjoying the fruit. We must carry the torch for younger generations by defending democracy and our important space. When we say women's participation in politics and polity, we have to go beyond the electoral processes and taking public offices. There are numerous ways in which women can exercise their agency and ability to shape and influence political processes. So these types of participation in a broader democratic system should be valued and appreciated. So since the broad-based mobilization is essential in democracy, it is important to support and accompany women at the community level to get involved in the state of affairs, including encouraging them to speak courageously against injustices and inequality. For that purpose, giving women a political cover is equally essential, crucial. There are also a strong correlations between having more women in politics and public life and having advances in gender-friendly policies and legal change. Gender-responsive policies and legal reforms are manifested in higher standards of living, better outcomes in education, health, and government performance, and responsiveness to the citizenry, as we all know, as with all women's rights and empowerment agendas, and given the resiliency of the patriarchy, the sustainability of gains cannot be taken for granted. Outcomes from these gender-responsive policies are the results of hard-won battles for feminist mobilization and the women's movement. So sustained gains in gender equality and women's empowerment are consistently secured through bottom-up mobilization and collective actions by gender activists like us. Mm-hmm. So when dealing with an unjust and illegal government, find allies to go against it together. In my life experience, for us to mobilize and freely express our positions and push for our agenda, we need a democratic space. When that democratic space is under threat, it is our duty to rise to the occasions and defend our rights. Since February 2021, when the brutal junta illegally seized the country, the quasi-democratic platform that Myanmar women have enjoyed for the last decades has suddenly disappeared. So we witnessed the speedy return of authoritarianisms applying the same old tactics, such as arbitrary arrest, indiscrimination and killings, unwarranted search and seizure of our property, and taking control of all branches of the government. So through the overtaking of our country by ethno-religious hyper-nationalism, the patriarchal military is a very real threat to our women's rights and pluralistic values that we have been trying to cement for a decade. Thank you.
Thank you, May. You laid out beautifully how much happens when democracy is supported and the difference it can make in a society. We've just got a couple minutes left. So really quickly, I'm just curious, this is called Democracy Game Changers in terms of what we've been talking about throughout these conversations. You're no doubt a game changer on women's rights. As you look globally, what are some of the ways that people can begin the process of really empowering women? What makes you hopeful of what is to come?
Governments can make a conscious effort to adopt policies and programs that enable greater women's participation in public life. This can be done through affirmative action, quotas, diversity, equity, and inclusions that are DEI measures, and not to forget finance in the advancement of the women, peace, and security agenda. So with these measures in place, no matter how capable women are, they will remain to be behind the scenes. Families can encourage their daughters to become civic-minded and participate in community affairs, starting with school activities, joining the Girl Scouts where girls' leadership and empowerment are built at an early age. Children can be taught the equal division of household responsibilities. Families have to learn that women's work is not just holding the duties of reproduction. And the international donor community must take seriously and learn to understand feminist financing and support local women's rights organizations who are at the forefront of defending our democratic space and serving as watch groups, especially in fragile contexts like in Myanmar. So they can create an avenue where women defenders from fragile and conflict-affected settings have an opportunity to share their experience, strategies, and voices, just like this opportunity that you are giving me now. So only then the policymakers and legislators from the capitals of other nations could adopt needed solutions so our women have the opportunity to mobilize and organize globally. So at this point, I would like to emphasize on sharing and making a space for women to involve in politics and the public life. The low level of women's participation in politics is not because they lack capacity or they are not empowered enough. No amount of empowerment programs will do good if the policymakers do not actively remove the barriers for participation and share the space with women. In fact, the existing structures do not enable for them to participate, and there exists structural glass ceiling for women in politics, defense sector, and businesses. There needs for conscious efforts to create space for women and girls to reach to the decision-making and leadership levels. So creating an enabling environment and conducive space are two key ingredients for women to claim their well-deserved place in politics, public affairs, and businesses too. So I would like to conclude with a few points. So in this dark time, I still keep my hope. No? When I see the women of Myanmar did not let happen the military attempt to take over the country. As you may recall, seeing tens of thousands of women and girls, young and old, flock to the streets to demand their power back from the hated junta. This resonates with Afghan and Ukrainian sisters who are doing everything in their power to defend their democracies. In this revolution, Myanmar women are at the forefront of denouncing and rejecting the coup and sparing no efforts to return the country to the path to democracy and a federal union. Women continue to wholeheartedly continue to the movement, protesting and fighting beside men in the civil disobedience movement. The armed struggle protests are civil society members serving as frontline defenders and service providers. They have participated in the formation of the National Unity Government and the National Unity Consultative Council as well. They have demonstrated, their technical expertise to be contributors. Even during the previous quasi-democratic regime, women in Myanmar make efforts to strengthen the democratic institutions and foster a democratic culture and norms. And you may wonder, why are we so invested in saving democracy? During the past decade, we deepened on a democratic platform. These institutions, as precarious as they were, with the military's continued involvement in politics, have been vital to advancing women's rights and promoting gender equality in Myanmar. Such platforms are there to protect our fundamental rights to organize, express our opinions, hold public demonstrations, and participate politically. Yes. Without a space to mobilize, in and where we can work to strengthen the rule of law of the country, we are left adrift.
May I have to tell you, it was so powerful. I traveled with President Obama to Myanmar, and I think the message that you are making about the power of the people who will not stand for anything less. I want to thank you so much for joining us. May Sabai Piu, Democratic activist, Burmese activist, director of Gender Equality Network. Thank you for your time, May. And boy, did May absolutely set the great stage for our next conversation. Our next panel is actually going to look into data. Data makes such a difference in having these conversations. How can we measure this idea that men's involvement in women's political empowerment is a sound approach to actually defending democracy? I'm pleased to welcome Gary Barker and Sandra Pepra. I want to start and introduce both of them. Gary is actually the founder and CEO of Equimundo, a global center that specializes in male allyship and gender equality. He's also co-founder of many organizations focused on this issue. And he co-created the International Men and Gender Equality Survey images. Sandra Pepra is the Senior Associate and Director for Gender, Women, and Democracy with NDI. She's also a political analyst and strategist, and much of Sandra's career has actually been spent working in or on transitional economies, focusing on building resilient and inclusive institutions. And actually, before joining NDI, she spent 13 years as a senior officer at the UK's Department for International Development. I want to thank you both very much for joining us. Sandra, I'd love to start with you. NDI clearly has taken a very particular stance on this issue, and they're continuing to champion this idea of men's roles in gender equality. Tell me a little bit, Sandra, about your experience. What has it shown you in terms of successes or failures on this particular issue?
Thanks, Rena. I think first, I just want to take a moment really to celebrate and stand in solidarity with women like May Sabe Piu, and others around the world. The defining image of the last 5 years has been often young women resisting and leading these revolutions and these struggles. And they've been very effective in mobilizing social movements and political forces too. Some of them have lost their lives, like Mariela Franco, the counselor in Rio de Janeiro, an Afro-Brazilian activist and rights. So just to say that and to thank May and the many, many women around the world who are championing these causes for rights and democracy. So the democracy game change, as you said at the top, that we are focused on today is really women's political empowerment. And that bare minimum, again, you mentioned it, even May mentioned it, would be a parity in numbers. But that's not enough, and we have to do more than that. And where we are now, I think, is with the realization that you can do so much with women's individual capacity, and May said it, women don't need much more capacity building. There are many of them out there, and frankly, men aren't required to reach a certain capacity level before they step in. They just go. So you can do so much with capacity building. We have started to shape and shift the institutional landscape for women's participation through, again, May mentioned it, quotas and other ways of really requiring the political institutions to open up and support women's engagement. But the third big area, and that's where we are today, really, that third big area is the sociocultural landscape. I always say that men is politics is the temple of masculinity, really. And what we're seeing and tracking is a clear relationship between the rolling back of rights of women, girls, gender and sexual minorities, and in fact, other minorities, and democratic backsliding. Chenoweth and Marx in their recent article said that the 21st century was demonstrating that misogyny and authoritarianism are not just common comorbidities, but mutually reinforcing. And this is really the heart of the discussion for us today. And Gary will have more to say on this, but there really is no coincidence that almost every autocrat or illiberal leader in the world is a man, with the corollary that the increase in the numbers of women as head of government or head of state is almost entirely limited to democratic or democratizing countries. So at one end of the spectrum, let me just finish this thought. The most tragic example is of the democratic backsliding and the reversal of women's rights is Afghanistan, where the new regime have dismantled all the rights that Afghan women gained over the last 20 years. And it appears that while rights are in decline for everyone in Afghanistan, women's rights and liberties are close to nil, with women being denied entry to public and private workplaces, and with property rights at a new low. But there are creeping rollbacks across the globe. According to VDEM, in the top 10 autocratizing states, they're focused on Turkey's withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention, for example, which is described by others as part of a response by the government to demands from alliances of men's rights groups and religious fundamentalists that consolidate a hold on power. And democratic backsliding and gender rights reversal are taking place in EU member states as well. It's a trend that we're seeing. And I think we need to understand that reversing this trend takes us firmly to working in the space of sociocultural norms, norm change, and addressing masculinities and other gender identities.
Gary, Sanders just beautifully laid out exactly what we're facing in this moment. You have actually looked at the statistics. Images has these statistics that say that men are actually hesitant to support policies that uplift women. I'm curious, as Sandra mentioned and sort of explained globally what we're looking at in this moment, in your experience, has this been the trend since you've been doing this study? Are we at a particular moment in this overall dismantling of gender rights? Do you see a world in which this can improve? And what do you think the strategies are needed to change this?
Yeah, all good questions. So to jump into it, I mean, I think we see a couple of big trends. One is where men feel economically at risk, and that seems to hold up, across time. they are less likely, either individually or in countries where lots of men feel that way, they seem less likely to support gender equality policies. They tend to dig into it's me against them. And the them can be women, the them can be sexual minorities, the them can be other economic groups, migrants, et cetera. We know the playbooks that authoritarian governments often use to do this. And I think this is the paradox that we have of thinking about patriarchy and men's power, which is patriarchy says to men, to be recognized as men, you've got to be a provider and often a protector. And then if the world, if the economic conditions around men don't make that possible, men feel their very identities, what they are supposed to be, are at risk. And so it's, we think it is pretty clear that we see in situations where men feel less threatened, they seem to be more likely to believe that gender equality is a good thing. And we see that at the country level as well as the individual level. I think what's different about recent years, we have seen with our research carried out over the course of about 15 years, that there does seem to be a steady backsliding on the generation of younger men believing in gender equality. They seem to be going backwards. What do we think is happening? Do we say that's greater economic insecurity in the world overall? We are reducing poverty. Certainly big differences across countries and places. We have done pretty well on reducing some of the worst of poverty in the world, and yet overall income inequality has gotten worse. Is that backsliding on men's support for gender equality related to that? Perhaps. It's also related to very deliberate efforts by authoritarian leaders to use a weaponization of masculinity as part of their discourse. It's very clear that the far right has been very, very strategic about how they use language around your manhood is at stake if you don't vote for me. And that does appeal to a lot of men. So I think our challenge, those of us who are trying to promote democracy and a full gender equality agenda, is to say, then what do we do? One is, I think it's important to say men are not a monolithic block. Everywhere we look, even in some countries where there's quite illiberal authoritarian rule, there's about a third of men who generally believe in gender equality, and at least some number who believe in things like quotas to support getting to gender equality. So I think one is we've got to come up with better strategies to talk to the men who are already on our side, and then to try to find ways to bring others toward our side. I think part of our challenge is how to say identity politics, identity-based politics certainly serve to bring attention to how specific groups, including women, of course, have been excluded from politics and other circles. But we've also got to figure out some language that is a bit more inclusive to say, we acknowledge that some of your anger about this is related to economic uncertainties, social uncertainties that you face. That doesn't mean I stop talking about gender equality as a moral imperative, of full rights for women, sexual minorities, and other groups as a full moral imperative. But it does say, I try to come up with language that tries to bring us all into this boat. I think of, say, Heather McGhee's book in the US on the sum of us. Is there language we can come up with of the need for social policies that say we need to bring all low income and lower income and follow on, kind of overall economic equality, but with special focus on gender equality within those kinds of policies. So I think one of our challenges is that, how do we see men having a stake in a more equitable society overall? How do we help those men who already believe and are on our side to see that we have something specific for them to do? And I think we have to get better about that. Strategies that say, we want you to be allies. Here's what that allyship means, whether it's leadership within political parties, whether it's very specific policies at the workplace, whether it's the care economy, violence prevention. We need specific strategies for each of those areas. And we need to say, we need inclusive policies that acknowledge, particularly for lower income men, that economic insecurity is a reality and that it often drives the worst of fear, and it leaves them very vulnerable to the kinds of messages that authoritarian leaders have gotten really good, far better than we have in terms of how they exchange playbooks across countries than I think we have as a movement, particularly as I look at our work around male allyship. We are not nearly as strong and useful or sort of as strategic in the use of media and messaging to bring men into this space.
Gary, I'm just curious how you even got down this path of drawing the connection between democracy and including women's participation and men's allyship. How did this even come about?
Uh, watching the horrors of it unfold, before us. Much of my career was spent in Brazil and watching what happened with the rise of Bolsonaro and other right-wing movements, watching how Bolsonaro used taking out of the school system in Brazil what he called the, in quotes, the gay kit, was actually educational material that we had worked on for years with partner organizations of building gender equality into one of the most extensive possibilities of inclusion of it within the education system. So some of this was acts of desperation, watching how the right wing has used messaging around fear of discussing healthy masculinities, men's roles in gender equality, fear of discussing what it would look like to have a fully equal world, and used it, basically used it for their gain. We've seen the same happen in the US. Materials that we developed and were piloting together with the CDC kicked out of funding from CDC during that wasn't CDC's fault. That was the issue of the Trump administration. So we've seen it from Hard Knocks in our own programming work of years of advocacy going into building conversations on healthy masculinities into education sectors and health sectors, seeing those roll back. And so it was obvious to us that we needed to, as a strategy, pay more attention to this. And I think political scientists have been looking at this far longer than we have, but we saw it as we watched these gains of 5, 7, 10 years, what women's rights activists are living today. We saw it very directly in our own programming and advocacy.
So fascinating. We've got a question from somebody from Nepal. Sandra, I'd love for you to take this. And I just want to remind everyone that you can submit questions right there at the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And you can ask our panelists here. This is from Nepal, Sandra, and the question is, when the trend is toward illiberalism generally, how can we focus on gender parity in the midst of this? Is the pathway gender rights first, then overall rights, or vice versa?
Brilliant question. And of course, I think, it's never going to be the same thing in every place. What we know is this relationship between societies, contexts where there are more rights for women tend to be more democratic, and vice versa. So you have to kind of look at your specific area and see how you make a breakthrough. But I think the underlying point is that gender equality is a democratic principle. You can't actually say you've got much of a democracy if you aren't actually persuading and pursuing gender equality. And I do think, Gary mentioned the broad societal movement that's needed, and I absolutely agree with that. I think we do have to find a way to activate and mobilize those men who are either undecided or complacent. I think the angry ones that Gary also spoke to are probably not the easiest to get to. And they have been weaponized. And I'm thinking now, when I'm thinking about the autocratic leaderships, I'm thinking of sort of 3 different kinds. The opportunistic backsliders who've ridden the wave, for example, of COVID to reinforce their positions through states of emergency or shrinking the political space. Then we have, again, Gary mentioned them, the patriarchal nationalists who drive conservative social agendas and are attacking gender theory. They belittle men who are interested in equality and demonize others in the sexual minorities. And then finally, and a growing group, and in a way they cut across both the other sectors, are the digital autocrats. And I think we can't understate the importance of what's happening in the digital space, where the continuum of gender-based violence has simply moved into this new technology, and it's being deliberately weaponized by the autocrats. So the addressing the issue will require action, both in the sort of community level, but the political structures where power sits and the manipulation of divisions and the driving of agendas that consolidate the power of certain groups versus pluralism versus greater inclusion, those cannot be ignored either, and they require a special focus.
Sandra, I keep thinking about what you said at the beginning of this conversation, how politics is the temple of masculinity. What do you believe that countries can do to adopt a more equitable practice that could really lead to better change?
Well, I think, Gary said it also, that first point is that we have to persuade people that gender equality is good for everyone. That's absolutely clear. I think we do understand that social movements and social organizing, the whole social justice piece, nationally, internationally, globally, this is a very important space for women because, again, the research is telling us that social movements and social organizing is more successful, more coherent, and more nonviolent when women are deeply involved. I think, too, that the institutional landscape is continuing to change. A few weeks ago at the global level, the IMF joined the rest of us in the world by launching almost an end of history moment with their new gender strategy. So, we understand that the landscape, the institutional landscape is shifting and women need to be visible before the state. So thinking specifically about things like legal ID, voting rights, property rights, social welfare, where women are recognized in their own right and for their own humanities are important. Women's voice as far as data is concerned, hugely important. Who controls data is absolutely key. And I have a great respect for an organization that I'm personally involved with right now, the White Ribbon Alliance, and their What Women Want survey, which has been described as the most subversive and disruptive of technologies, because this is women speaking directly to what they want, how they want it. And, it's their lived experience that is counting. And then, we have to support women and girls and gender minorities, the brave individuals and their movements that are represented by May today and others. And that support requires accountability to their experience. Gary mentioned, understanding what you're supposed to do, how you're supposed to do it. It's not an assumption that any of us know more, we should act, or that we should act on their behalf, or frankly, that we need to be let down slowly. That's just not accountability. We need to respect women's lived experience. Madeleine Albright, our late and very much loved and lamented chair of our board, said, what people have the capacity to choose, they have the ability to change. And that, in a way, is the duality of this point, because autocrats know that, and yet we should be working to empower and give people that capacity to choose and to change. And right there, in one of the many, many ways that she shared her wisdom with us, we have a clear message about the importance of equality and inclusion, and particularly of gender equality.
What a great point, the ability to choose and to change. Gary, I want to turn to you. We've got a question from Canada, and someone's asking, do you feel that, do both of you feel that the data is accurate, given authoritarian governments and the rising fear of speaking up? Could we actually be experiencing more discrimination than is being reported? How do we keep track? Gary?
Yeah, good question. I mean, with whose data counts, I think we do trust it when we have the chance to triangulate it. So we never trust a single, one single study. Are we listening to multiple ways? Are we listening to women about men's lives, men talking about their households? Are we doing the qualitative to go with the quantitative? So yeah, I agree. Do we believe in government data that's reported out? Well, it depends on the country. So yeah, I do think it is important that we listen to what is the context we're asking the questions in. Are we wearing badges that say we represent a government organization, a not-for-profit? a respected research organization. All those things matter a huge amount these days. It has gotten more difficult to carry out some kind of survey data because of the way that we're found these days, whether people don't want to open doors to us because they perceive we represent a certain political view, or whether if you do the online data, lots of folks who've spent years figuring out how to do that well also know just the biases that show up. So we need to ask them carefully and make sure that we're always triangulating and listening to those different perspectives. But I think we can see some trends that we feel pretty confident about.
On the question here, Gary, from Canada about, do you believe we could be experiencing more discrimination, that perhaps it's underreported? What do you say about that?
I mean, there's tons of it that's showing up. And I think we have asked questions about new experiences of discrimination online. So cyberbullying and cyber harassment. I think, whether we're asking this across all kinds of countries is to be seen. But I think we are getting, I think there's a lot of being attuned to asking of these different kinds. So, I think it is important that we neither say it's happening too much, but I think we also, in our research, need to look at ways that good kind of gender equitable practices happen in relationships and workplaces too. I think we can also bias our questions in the way that we asked only looking for harm that's happening, whereas we also tend to sometimes miss in our research the ways that heterosexual couples and others are figuring out some dimensions of gender equality at the household level. So I think it is important that we look at bias that can sometimes go in multiple directions. I don't, as we do big data sets, they tend to kind of homogenize and we come up with a single story. And I think it is important to acknowledge, as we look across settings, there may be kinds of discrimination that are increasing because there's new places they can happen. Online is one of those, but there may be at the other end of a spectrum, new kinds of collaboration that are happening as care work is shared more equitably in some households in any case. And so as dynamics in workplaces shift, because there is more women's leadership in some workplaces. So I think it's important that we not try to find a single story in there.
Okay, that's a great point, Gary. Sandra, I've got a question from you from Leslie Cosgrove from Amaranth Village. And she's asking, women are often conflicted about their own political participation. Are women leaving women behind when they are hoping to address men and the government? The patriarchy and the government as well are issues. Do you, Sandra, what's your sense on that about women leaving other women behind? We've talked about the role of men and the importance of that, but what about the inclusion of all women?
Yeah, no, this is a question. It goes to the heart of really the key issue, which is that we are all socialized. We are socialized to be one or the other. We're socialized to be powerful, or we're socialized to be, if you like, disempowered. And I think many women's experience around the world, and I hear what Gary said about not drawing a single story, but there wouldn't be a feminist movement if it wasn't a common and a global thread that in general terms, women are unequal. I mean, we know, for example, that women globally only access 75% of the rights that men do. So it's not as if there isn't some grounding to this, the sense of the lived experience of inequality. Another one of Secretary Albright's oft-quoted phrases was, hell has a special place for women who don't help other women. I think that that's a little harsh, but it is the case that it is not the systems, and I go back to the fact that we're talking about systems and structures of power that are driven by incentives and networks of men and masculinity in ways that either require women to conform to that space as huge socialization, or they keep women out. And I think, the sort of work that's been recently done by Valerie Hudson and her colleagues, all of which, Gary, to your point, all of which was actually funded by the Department of Defense, really speaks to this issue about the first political order, and the first political order being the separation, if you like, in power, starting in the household between girls and boys, which grows outwards towards, in fact, our whole kind of political political landscape, the institutions, the culture, the practices, the exchange of rents, incentives, all those things are actually driven from that first political order.
We've literally got about 60 seconds left, but I want to take one final thought from both of you in the few seconds we really have left. Gary, I'd like to start with you and end with you, Sandra. Ultimately, from the lenses that both of you have come to this program with, what do you believe can be done tangibly to strengthen democracies? Gary?
Thinking about the gender equality lens, very much want to focus on helping men see their stake in equality. And I think that sounds impossible. It maybe sounds utopic, but I do think we can get men to see it. I think if they live aspects of democracy in the household, if they live it in their school practices and the other peer networks they hang out at, we can see that they live it more growing up. And so I think it's paying attention to the big picture and the big numbers on where women's voices are heard equally in politics. We also have to think of what happens in early childhood and beyond, that boys are made to, brought up to, forced to live in their micro worlds where democracy is reinforced every day. So I think, paying attention to what happens at home, how boys learn and are encouraged and made to see the benefits of gender equality. I think we help plant the seeds for men who later on in workplaces and how they vote become allies for full equality, and I hope for democracy.
Sandra?
And I'm going to say almost exactly the same as Gary has said. I think it is very much now that we have to focus on these issues around gender norms and shifting those norms, because those norms define and inform our political spaces, and they define and inform the views of power, the use of power as a currency. And so for us, this is absolutely key. And, we've been doing a lot of work recently with our Men Power and Politics tool and other things to really shift the focus so that we are, to Gary's point, supporting men not to become just tactical allies for one election or another election, or they pass a quota just in order to, consolidate their base of power, but to make them transformative allies for gender equality. And that's where we want to go. But it's hard because, when you're used to privilege, equality feels like oppression. And I think we have to understand that as well.
So many gems, Sandra, you and Gary have dropped in this conversation. I'm so grateful for the work both of you are doing. I want to thank you both very much, Sandra Pepra and Gary Barker. Thank you guys for all of your efforts and also for joining us today.
Thanks, Reema.
Thanks for having us.
You bet. Well, our next conversation, I'm honored to speak with yet another leader whose legacy has been a champion for women's rights. Dr. Fuzile Mlabo Nga. Let me try that again. Dr. Fuzile Mlabo Nga. Did I get that right, Dr. Nga?
Yes, close.
Fuzile Mlabo Nga. I've been practicing all morning, so I want to apologize to you. She is an amazing expert in this field, founder of the Mlabo Foundation and former UN Undersecretary General and Executive Director for UN Women. She established initiatives such as the He for She for men and boys to address gender equality, and has also worked tirelessly on programs and policies to reduce inequality. I want to welcome you very much, Fumzile. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
You bet. I want to start with your time at UN Women. What can you tell us really about the state of global gender issues at the time? And do you see a difference between when you started then and now, given how democracy is really under attack around the world?
Well, I would say at the beginning of my first term, I was there for 8 years. Even though it was difficult, you could see the potential for progress. More representation of women was possible. We did more laws and supported actively by government, for instance, addressing violence against women. And it was not very easy for people who are against empowerment of women to have space, because there was sort of a collaboration of the forces that were pushing for gender equality. And just midway, literally, and I think the government of President Trump had something to do with the change of the environment, but they were right-wing governments all over the world. Things just changed drastically. We saw the attack of women's rights. We saw the denial of reproductive rights, and more disturbing, those who were very proudly anti-women just were comfortable to state their views. And so the fight for women's rights was very public at that point.
Why do you think that these attacks on rights, on the voice, the agency of women and girls have marginalized communities, with other marginalized communities? Why do you think they've become such a target in this anti-democratic toolkit of authoritarians around the world?
I mean, if you think of just what patriarchy stands on, what racism stands on, these beliefs are very much based on people who think that there is something to lose if you let other people in, that it is important that just a few of them are privileged. And if you don't actively fight against that, as well as prove that it is not true, those beliefs become the dominant beliefs. It is also important to fight against those beliefs, starting with children at a very young age, so that as they grow up, they've already internalized equality as just a way of life. It is important that, for instance, girls and boys are not separated, that they do things together, that they learn to respect each other over a long period of time, so that as they grow older, these kind of discriminatory practices can be more foreign than normal. So, the people who believe in gender inequality, who promote gender inequality, feel that for them to be in a step up, somebody must be in a step down. And they're always creating these levels, where they would belong and where the others would be, so that there is this hierarchy. And, it takes all shapes and forms. It becomes a normal way of living. And before you know, it's all of society behaving that way.
Yeah. Phumzile, what would you say that male political leaders can do to really break the link between this anti-democratic reversal of women's rights and the rise of authoritarian and illiberal regimes?
No, I want to agree with Gary, and it's just wonderful to listen to him again, that we have to reach to as many men as we can to make sure that they are the ones who embrace the change. We have to make sure that they understand that gender equality does not take something away from them, that they have something to gain and they have something to lose from discrimination and the many expectations that are put on men. Sometimes it's expectations that men even struggle to shoulder. So as much as over a long period of time, our struggle for gender equality was very much focused on mobilizing women. I I would like to think that even on this call, the majority of people who are listening to us are women. So we have invested a lot of time talking to people who are the victims, who are not the wrongdoers, and the people we should be engaging, winning over, are the ones that are missing. And we really have to change the strategy and the way of work, which is why at UN Women, I was clear that UN Women, even though our mandate within the UN was to work with and for women, we couldn't do that without having a hand in mobilizing and encouraging men to be part of this journey.
It's so fascinating, Phumzile, to hear you say that even back then you understood the importance of including men into the conversation. I want to thank you so much, Phumzile, for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you.
You bet. And now, to hear the perspective of the United States government, I'm excited to welcome remarks from Rod Brzezinski, Special Assistant to the President and National Security Council Senior Director for Democracy and Human Rights at the National Security Council. He's going to dive into how gender rights are actually a national security issue. Let's listen.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rob Brzezinski, and I'm Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Democracy and Human Rights at the White House National Security Council. I want to thank Foreign Policy and NDI for hosting this event and inviting me to speak about the critical issue of how women's rights are vital to security and prosperity. Gender equity and equality is a top priority of the Biden-Harris administration. When he took office, President Biden mandated the development of our country's first ever national strategy on gender equity and equality, which sets forth an ambitious agenda to advance gender equity and equality in both domestic and foreign policy. Released in October, the strategy outlines a comprehensive government-wide approach and guides the work of all federal departments and agencies, including those focused on advancing our national security and foreign policy interests. It identifies 10 strategic priorities, including the imperative of promoting gender equality and democracy, political participation, and leadership. And it recognizes that advancing gender equity and equality is essential not only to economic growth and development, but also to democratic resilience and the political stability and security of nations across the globe. Promoting women's full participation in leadership roles and ensuring that they're well represented at the tables where decisions are made at every level are preconditions to advancing strong and sustainable democracies, which rest on the promise that all people, regardless of their gender, race, ethnicity, income level, or other factors, are able to participate fully and equitably in society. That's why advancing women's full participation is a White House priority, not just as a moral imperative, but as a strategic necessity. There's a clear evidence-based case for increasing women's political participation and leadership, which has been proven to promote equality, social welfare policies like education and healthcare, political stability, and international security. The status of women and the stability of nations are inextricably linked. Societies that foster gender discrimination and allow oppressive gender norms to flourish are more likely to be unstable. By the same token, rising authoritarianism generates and feeds off of growing gender inequality. So it's no accident that these trends are linked. In order to ensure women's full and meaningful participation in society, we must pursue reform that enshrines gender equity and equality in the law, and we must ensure that rights on paper are fully implemented in practice. Essential to advancing democracy around the world is the imperative of promoting women's participation in peace processes and negotiations. The Women, Peace, and Security agenda is a cornerstone of U.S. government efforts geared toward averting and preventing conflict, and one that I've been proud to have worked on over multiple presidential administrations. In July, we submitted to Congress the 2022 Women, Peace, and Security Report, which came from the Departments of State, Defense, Homeland Security, and the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, on our continued efforts. This report reflected a new and strengthened strategy to promote women's participation in conflict prevention and resolution, and to promote regional stability and security in partnership with countries facing a variety of stressors, like climate change and democratic backsliding. The administration has also taken significant steps toward addressing gender-based violence, GBV, which is a critical priority for the president. Throughout his career, President Biden has understood that gender-based violence is an abuse of power. Our forthcoming global GBV strategy will further outline our firm commitment to preventing and responding to gender-based violence wherever it occurs, whether in private relationships or in the public sphere. Both online and offline, violence and threats of violence can be used as a tool to intimidate, control, and silence women's voices in political representation. Undermining women's autonomy and agency runs directly counter to our democratic principles. And this is especially evident in the many ways that women politicians, journalists, activists, and public figures are targeted with online harassment and abuse. That's why the Biden-Harris administration announced the Global Partnership for Action on Gender-Based Online Harassment and Abuse at the first Summit for Democracy hosted by President Biden last December, an initiative co-led by Australia, Denmark, the Republic of Korea, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. The global partnership brings together governments, international organizations, civil society, and the private sector to better prioritize, understand, prevent, and address the growing scourge of technology-facilitated gender-based violence. We know that the threat of violence and harassment has led some women politicians to forego re-election campaigns and has prevented untold numbers from seeking political office in the first place. These threats include sexualized threats of violence, cyberstalking, and gender disinformation campaigns designed to discredit women leaders. Women who are simply exercising their right to vote are nearly 4 times more likely to fall victim to violence than men, while women campaigning for or serving in political office face elevated risks of violent threats, including threats of sexual assault. Online harassment and abuse against women leaders reflect deeply rooted beliefs about gender roles and norms. A UN report recently found that globally, almost 50% of people, both men and women, feel that men make better political leaders. This troubling data point implicates not only the present, but also the future of our democracy. The Biden-Harris administration is committed to promoting equal representation in public life and at all levels of government, irrespective of gender, race, sexual orientation, gender identity, and other factors. For societies to thrive, women and girls, men and boys, and gender-diverse individuals must have equal access to and control over resources, as well as equal rights and opportunities as business owners and citizens, peace builders, and leaders. We recognize the importance of engaging men and boys as positive agents for change for gender equality, to prevent gender-based violence, address inequities in health, and support women's political participation. I'll close by saying that promoting democracy without the full participation of women is just a contradiction in terms. Here at the National Security Council, we're working in close coordination with the Gender Policy Council and our partners across the federal government to ensure that the inclusion and participation of women is central to our collective efforts to defend and strengthen democracy across the world. As we continue to collaborate with governments and multilateral organizations to make progress on these issues, we look forward to working with and learning from our civil society partners as well. Thank you very much.
Rob Brzezinski of the National Security Council. Rob, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank everyone for this incredible conversation. Our experts are such specialists in this field, and we've taken a really hard look at how do we strengthen democracy while uplifting gender issues. Today kicks off a long line of really incredible programming the foreign policy team is producing in conjunction with the UN General Assembly. I hope you join Foreign Policy for a conversation on resilience, Building in the Hardest Places with Food for the Hungry. This Friday, September 16th at 10 a.m. Eastern, we're going to take a look at the next steps to build global resilience, especially in the light of the Global Fragility Act. And on Wednesday, September 21st, we're hosting our second annual Foreign Policy Tech Forum. That'll be in New York City. We're going to focus on the intersection of technology and international policy with conversations on the future of the open internet, US competitiveness in the tech sector, and much more. You can join us in person or online. Again, a very big thanks to the National Democratic Institute for supporting this project. We hope you'll stay tuned for updates and find out more at foreignpolicy.com. There's so many events and such great programming. Until then, stay tuned. We hope to see you back soon. Thanks again.